Welcome to the Intentional Leader Podcast presented by Reenergize Professional Coaching. We appreciate you listening in and learning with us. The stories and leadership tips you hear will help you become a great leader. Listen intentionally. Now, to our host, Sean Olson.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast. This is the podcast where you hear the real stories of normal people just like you who have become extraordinary leaders. You'll learn some valuable lessons from their lives, lessons you can apply to become the best leader you were created to be. When you become an intentional leader, lives are changed. I'm your host, Sean Olson. I'm an executive coach, business owner, author, and speaker. Thank you for joining us today for our episode. I am pleased to introduce our guest for today, Kieron James. Kieron is the CEO and co-founder of Wonderful, and you're going to hear all about that today. And today he comes to us from Spain. So Kieron, thank you for joining us today all the way from Spain.
Thanks for having me, Sean. It's my pleasure. Yeah, enjoying the sunny climes of Spain. So my time's split between London half the time and Spain the other half of the time. And I have to say, I probably prefer Spain.
That makes sense. And I'm sure our listeners are sitting here going, he does not have a Spanish accent. Nobody does have that English accent, doesn't he? So well, we're excited to have you here. And Kieron, you know, every show we begin with the same question. We want our listeners just to tap into our guests and to understand that we're normal people. You are a fantastic yet normal person who's done incredible things and learned in leadership. So give us kind of a walk through your professional life, but more than that, the leadership lessons learned along the way that brought you to this point with Wonderful.
Absolutely. Very happy to do that. Yeah, it's been an interesting and probably quite circuitous route into fintech, which is where I find myself today. Started out initially in a trade association. So I did my degree in economics, worked in a trade association in London for probably about 4 or 5 years. That was really my first job just to pay the rent because my other interests were playing in a band. So thought that the streets of London were going to be paved with gold and I was going to make my career and mark on the world playing the drums. Lessons learned from the day one, but there we go.
Do you still play drums today, though, just for fun?
I do, but
that's awesome.
Actually enjoy probably these days doing more electronic music. But yeah, that's how I got started. Moved from there into high school teaching, and I think that was my first real opportunity to do any kind of leadership. So very early on in that career, I sought promotion to become head of department. Probably after the first term as a teacher, which was completely fortuitous, the head of department left the day I started. So she had a term's notice and then she was on her way. And I thought, well, let's be ambitious and see whether I can apply for the job. And luckily enough, I was accepted and took that job, which was amazing. Left that and ran a training institute in the Middle East for a little while. So that was quite a big change geographically and culturally in every sense, really.
What type of training was that?
It was vocational training. So my teaching, did the degree in economics, taught business studies and economics, and then went out to the Middle East to really teach vocational business courses. And that was an interesting one in the sense that it was probably the wrong qualification for the market. So the vocational qualifications that were being taught by the institute that I was working for were all delivered in English in the interior of the Sultanate of Oman, right in the interior, in a fairly small town where English certainly wasn't the first language, and they were delivered and assessed and everything in English. So I think it was really challenging for a lot of the students. So in essence, that funding on that got pulled, and I ended up back in the UK. And from there, really, a number of different businesses. So that was my first start in running a business after running the training institute. Came back and I was kind of on my ear thinking, what do I do next? And I set up a web design business. And since then, I've been involved in kind of information technology businesses for the last 25 years, I guess.
Okay. So what was that transition like? So going from being the instructor to really kind of being behind the computer screen.
Initially, that
not
was
in front of people anymore.
Yeah, that was kind of weird because I've been out there and And I guess some teachers will say this, it's almost like being on stage. You've got an audience, you're imparting knowledge, hopefully, and facilitating learning, getting people enthused, and then suddenly to be on your own in your dining room effectively with a laptop building websites for clients was quite a cultural shift for me. But I got ambition even straight away to try and grow that business and bring on some additional developers. So that was always in the back of my mind. If we could make this work quite early on, then I'd be hiring staff quickly. So yeah, that was always a plan.
And so did that happen? Did you bring it on, build it up?
It did. There was a nervousness when you're hiring your first person. There's always that nervousness about paying their wages. It's okay not paying yourself, but not paying somebody else is kind of a bit frightening.
It doesn't work as well.
And I remember a conversation actually with one of my co-founders today was, if you're thinking about hiring somebody, you probably should have done it 3 months ago, which I thought was really sage advice, because I think often founders wait too long to hire that first employee. So I brought her on really reluctantly and nervously, thinking, I'm going to give her 2 days a week, and at least I can cover the salary for that. And I think it was within about 3 or 4 weeks she went full time, because I just needed that person.
Wow!
So that was great.
But obviously, she brought value to what you were doing, and that's the interesting piece I've found with a lot of founders that I've talked to, and being one myself. We always underestimate how much work others can do until we let them in and let them share what they think they can do.
And you're completely right. And I think it's also recognizing as founders that you don't have to be good at everything, because that's another mistake that's often made. I'm not particularly strong in the financial area. Kind of ironic, given that I'm running a fintech business these days.
Fintech, yeah.
But it's not my strength. I'm not a numbers guy. And I remember, and this happened quite recently, after many, many years of often having that kind of imposter syndrome and feeling like a charlatan because you feel like you should know everything. And I was asked a question by our head of finance. I didn't know the answer. And I said, I'm really sorry, I've not got that to hand. And she said, well, that's fine. That's what you pay me for. And I thought it was just such a great, those 6 words were really, really important to me, and kind of just making that, You're absolutely right. That is what I pay you for. And I don't need to be good at everything. And it was the same thing going back all those years with that very first hire. She was a fantastic all-rounder, so a brilliant developer, really good coder, but actually really good in so many other aspects of the business that it just felt like a really strong extra pair of hands. Whether that was meeting clients, making outbound calls, doing the coding, doing some SEO back in the day as well. She could turn her hand to pretty much everything.
Yeah. So tell me about the growth of that company. I know you ultimately exited. Tell me about the growth of it, but then even more than that, how your role changed with that growth.
The growth came, we brought on more clients, we brought on more developers, but it's kind of quite a tough gig, and I'm sure it still is. I found it quite hard in the sense that from first pitching a job to getting paid could be quite a long time, with quite a lot of changes along the way from the client, which meant, it was pretty intensive work. A lot of it, you thought you were at the finish line, and often you weren't. So you'd still be negotiating and still talking, can you move this here? Can you change the color of that? Can you add 3 more tabs or whatever it might be? There was always a bit more work to be done. So I think part of the skills of finding the right people were also getting really good client managers on the team too. So people who were, again, multi-skilled, that could do the sales piece, but that could also manage those relationships with customers as well, and make sure that was smooth. But I think that was really one of the kind of epiphanies for me. Was I was also working at the time with somebody who was providing domain names for our customers. So we had a third-party provider of domain names. Obviously, web clients need domain names for their websites.
Correct.
And it was that moment when I realized, actually, in terms of the work that's been done up front, all that groundwork in terms of building that domain name registration process, once it's done, it's done. And effectively, there is no longer that long client negotiation piece. The person comes onto the website, chooses the domain name, pays for it, and the domain name registrar has been paid. That's it. And I think that for me was an important lesson in everything that we've done since. It's been, can we produce something where we're working really hard to make the process of finding us quite easy through SEO, to make the process of using the service, of signing up for the service really easy. Again, good user interface design and that kind of thing, a really slick process. And then can we make the process of using the product easy as well? If we can do all of those, then we can automate it and become mass market. So I think that was one of my real kind of key moments in terms of business development, was recognizing that was a strength that I wanted to use and deploy in any of the businesses.
Yeah, so you've got that critical thinking, strategic thinking, thinking ahead, really thinking at scale, right? That's probably one of the greatest faults of founders is we think incrementally and we're scared to make big bets or think, hey, this thing can really scale, but you're strategic about how we can scale and automate from day one.
I think, and I think we've done that from that business forward. We've always done that. It's been one of the key questions with all of the developers that we've hired over the years is that's fine. It's great at the volumes it's doing. Will there need to be a pause for us to get to the next step in the ladder, or will we be able to do that seamlessly? Because if there's got to be a pause, we've got a problem. And that's a challenge technically to do that, because you don't want resources that are lying there redundant, completely just waiting for that growth. So you've got to manage that in an effective way, but with minimum downtime and as seamlessly as possible.
Yeah. So you ultimately exited that company.
Yep.
Then what was next?
So I joined the domain name registration business. So the domain name, that the guy that we were buying domain names from, who's I mentioned before, he's now our co-founder with this business. We've worked together for the last 25 years. He basically offered me a job working for him. I joined that business, sold him the web design business and its clients. And my only kind of, I guess, wish in that taking that job was that I could go and work in South America. So I've always been keen to travel. My wife's Spanish, hence being in Spain. And I wanted to explore a little bit more. So that domain name business was growing really rapidly in the UK, but looking for international markets, and Latin America was one of the ones that we wanted to exploit. This was about probably 1999. So I joined and basically took the whole model that we'd developed in the UK and applied that as best we could in Argentina and in Brazil.
My goodness.
So that was interesting as well, and again, huge lessons learned there from going out and thinking, well, I've got some Spanish language. I've also got a Spanish wife. We can hire a team on the ground, and we'll translate the existing UK site from English into Spanish and into Portuguese, and it'll be fine. That's all there is to it. How naive you can be with 2020 hindsight in that. But I've realized now that so much of this is about, it's not translation, clearly it's a full localization and tailoring the product to suit the market and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to you about that. I want to sit on this topic for a second about international. The majority of our audience is in the US, although we have an audience around the world, probably 80% in the US right now. I hope that keeps shrinking as the international audience grows. But most people are absolutely afraid to go international with their business. And it's really just a fear factor. And the fear, I feel, oftentimes is based on ignorance. Like we're afraid of doing it, but we don't know why we're afraid of doing it. So what would be your one tip to go after it? And what would be your one caution for them to not go after it?
I think the caution I've probably already mentioned, and that was the lesson learned, is don't treat every market as the same and just assume that you can translate your website and then you'll be good for Germany, because it ain't that simple. In terms of the positives, I think it's just about doing the research into that market, understanding how that market operates, understanding how the buyers operate. I mean, when we went into Latin America, I think in a number of the countries that we were looking at, credit card penetration was at around 13% or even lower. And yet we were trying to sell services online using credit cards. And it's just, and you look back now and think it's such an incredible gaffe. And we had to rethink that and come up with other solutions about how we might approach that problem. So I think clearly, like anything, like a domestic market, thorough research and as much as you can find about how the market operates before you go. But then, have a go. It's like anything. there's no harm in dipping a toe as long as you can do that with some caution and, not throwing all caution to the wind and spending a fortune on it.
Right. Yeah, I love it. So what came after the domain company?
So domain name registrations, I left. We did a stint kind of shortly after that, and also before, where I'd been involved in co-founding a business, then backed out for a while and then rejoined, which was company formations online. So again, we started that in 1998. I think from the research we did at the time, we were the first online company formation agent in the world. So that was quite an interesting one for us as well, taking all that paper-based activity and putting it into what was actually a single form online. So you can imagine how onerous that would have been to complete by today's standards of being able to save it as you go along. There was none of that.
Mm-hmm.
It was all of the directors, all of the addresses, all of the registered office address, all of the details in one form. And if you lost it halfway through, back to the beginning. So we did that. After the domain name registration business, I then went into telephony, which actually came about during my return to the company formation business. So you can imagine with company formations, everyone sees their clients or the clients of the company formation business as being a real opportunity. So we were approached all the time by people looking to sell to these newly incorporated business and wanting to partner with us. And interestingly, again, you look at that with clarity and you think, well, they're newly incorporated businesses. They probably don't have very deep pockets. And therefore, there wasn't a great deal of opportunity. It was where cost savings could be made was the biggest opportunity. And one of those at the time that we were doing that was around telephony services for small businesses. And we were able, through some regulatory changes, to introduce some services that were effectively free of charge for the business and paid for via the caller. And we could do clever things with the telephony, like deliver calls to mobiles during the working day, then voice to email in the evening, set up multiple recipients and hunt groups and all of that kind of thing through a web interface. So that was where I went next for a little while. And then we sold that business in, I think, 2012. Stayed in telecoms for a while, but then went to the complete opposite side. So we were doing all of the outbound call communications for UK call centres. So very different audience. We'd gone from kind of an SME market with thousands and thousands of users to, a handful of very large UK contact centres.
So you have been jumping around regularly. What drives that in you? Is it just that serial entrepreneur spirit? Is it just taking advantage of what's in front of you? What drove that?
I think it's interesting, and listening to your podcast and the whole intentional leader thing, it made me think a little bit about what's happened in my career and how much of it is intentional, how much of it is serendipity, how much of it is opportunity that then you create the intention from. And I look back and I think there's been a lot of that. There's not been an intention to go into telephony. That kind of came about through seeing an opportunity in terms of the services that we could offer to those company registration clients. Similarly, the business that I'm in now, which might be a reasonable segue into that, has been completely serendipitous. But I guess one of the common themes has always been around it being, I describe it as zeros and ones. So selling digital services effectively, whatever they might be, from forming a company, registering a domain name, making a telephone call, through to the fintech payment services that we're doing today. It's all got that same theme of, can we deliver it online? Can we make it easy to find, easy to register, easy to use? So that definitely is a recurring theme. But in terms of the intention of starting the business, that's often been serendipitous.
Yeah. But you'd never backed off either.
No,
right?
No, we're definitely pretty relentless in terms of making it work. This one came about. This was probably the most interesting, though, because we were running that telephone services business back in 2016. And shortly prior to 2016 starting, my son decided he was going to jump out of an aeroplane for a charity to support one of his friends who had terminal cancer.
Wow.
And he did his parachute jump, and we thought that's probably going to be the most interesting part of that day, him jumping out of the aeroplane. But actually, what turned out to be the most interesting part of that day was his absolute outrage when he understood how much of the funds that he'd raised, by asking his friends and family and whoever else to donate to this parachute jump, were being lost. He was using an online giving platform that was a for-profit giving platform. There were deductions to cover card fees, deductions to cover platform fees, deductions effectively to pay the shareholders at the end of the year, deductions from tax incentives that are really aimed at benefiting charities. And he thought all the money he was raising, probably quite naively, was going to charity and was going to support that charity.
Right.
So that was again one of those moments when you think, I wonder whether we can do something about that. I wonder whether those very talented engineers in our telecoms business and developers and all of those people wouldn't mind turning their hand to doing something during the coffee breaks and lunch hours and weekends and see whether we can build a competitor platform that's completely free for the charities, that every single penny goes to the charity with no deductions whatsoever. So,
my goodness.
So that was how we got started with Wonderful. It was looking at the kind of virtuous circle of donors, fundraisers, and charities, and thinking, is there room for a fundraising platform to sit in the middle and serve those amazing people? And that was the starting point for it.
Wow, that's an incredible story. There's a part of your story that you just shared there, though, that I want our listeners to catch. You had your telephony company, you had all these computer engineers and developers. And I'm going to make the assumption, because of your heart for people and because of what they've seen in the culture of the company, you said, hey, we're thinking about this, and they were doing it on their own time. And then ultimately, did they transition from that company into Wonderful?
That's exactly what happened. But along the way, I have to say that it was such a rewarding thing for everybody to do. There've been a couple of moments along the journey where you've realized that they're probably enjoying that work far more than they're enjoying their, in inverted commas, day job. And similarly, we employed external agencies. Like we had a PR agency that were paid for by the telecoms business, but of course we weren't paying anyone from the charity giving platform, because that was the way it operated. It didn't pay anyone. We didn't get salaries from it. We're all paid by the telecoms business, and every penny went to the charities. But funnily enough, frequently they would win awards for the work they did on the side for the fundraising platform, and not really win many awards for the telecom service that they were being paid for. So everyone loved it. It was a great thing to be involved in for obvious reasons. It's clear that you're motivated by a greater purpose, and that you're doing something that gives back your talent and skill. We had some amazing engineers, we had some amazing developers, amazing marketing people, and they were all really, really happy to turn a hand to that.
Wow. So it's Wonderful global today. Who are the typical users of the platform? So
what happened along the way? We started this. We often call it the side hustle without the hustle. So it was very much a philanthropic project that we did in our spare time. And more we found that the customer service team that were supporting the telecoms business were probably spending more hours supporting the charities, donors, and fundraisers. But what also happened is we created effectively a success paradox. And people said this from the beginning. They said, it's fantastic, it's really well-intentioned, but you won't scale. And the reason you won't scale is the cost of processing the donations is always going to outstrip your corporate sponsorship. So initially we funded it through the telecoms business. Then we found a high street bank to become a corporate sponsor. And more what we were doing was turning around to that high street bank and saying, we need more money to pay our card processing fees. And really, that was the only hard cost of operating that business. It was the only one that we couldn't sink somewhere else. Hosting was fine, and the developers were all giving the time free. But that we obviously had to pay. We had to pay someone to process those payments. So we were then kind of overtaken by events because COVID hit, and something had to give. We were providing telephone conferencing services. A large number of NHS, the National Health Service trusts, were clients of that. Clearly, everyone's conference calling. And we said, well, let's pause the fundraising platform until we can figure this out. What happened next was actually, again, this kind of penny drop serendipitous moment that really created the business that I'm involved in today. we'd paused the platform. About 3 weeks later, I was on LinkedIn and I saw somebody who was having their head shaved during lockdown. I think very creatively they call it locks off for lockdown, for
I like
charity.
that phrase. Yeah.
And they posted a link to make a donation, and I clicked the link and made my donation. And it was through this thing that I'd never heard of called open banking. And what happened was the money effectively securely went directly from my account to the charities. And there was no card. There was, no debit card, no anything. It just looked to be a really secure thing. I was basically authorizing this in my mobile banking app. It was all very secure, super fast, really easy to do. And it was that moment when you think, actually, we can restart the fundraising platform, reopen, remove cards completely from that donation flow, reduce our cost instantly by 90% in terms of processing payments, and therefore increase our reach and impact massively. So we did, within 6 months, we were back open with an open banking provider in place. But again, using that term probably a little too much during this episode, but penny drop moment again, you suddenly realize that if that's a problem we're solving for the fundraising platform, then that problem exists everywhere. The cost of moving money is just becoming prohibitive through cards. So that's how we got started with this. And effectively, shortly after that, we sold the telecoms business, moved the entire team into this new fintech, and started to get our licenses in place to be a payment processor.
My goodness. So that payment processing and the open banking, like in the US, that's the equivalent of like a Venmo, a Cash App, Zelle for banks. Similar to that, or how's it different?
It is similar. In terms of the process, it's very similar. The money's moving from your bank account directly to the recipient bank account. The difference is this has been kind of mandated in the UK and in a lot of countries. And the banks were obliged to open up their APIs to fintechs like us. Obviously, the fintechs need to be authorized, and that's no walk in the park. It's a very involved process. But once you've completed the authorization, and effectively that gives us permission with your consent as the payment service user to move that money into a third-party account. The beauty of it is you're removing, probably a dozen intermediaries in a card transaction. They're just being removed completely. So there's no pie to slice up anymore. There's just one provider sitting in the middle, which is why we can drastically reduce those costs. So, we've moved in a commercial space. The charities never pay. The charities will never pay. We always provide that service completely free of charge for them. But as I mentioned now, our corporate sponsorship budget is no longer required effectively. We can do that for free and it doesn't really cost us anything. But in terms of a commercial client, then we're reducing those fees, which are typically with a card, in the UK, 1.4% plus 20 pence per transaction. We're taking that down to a penny with no percentage fees. So it's literally a penny to move that money.
My goodness. And so then your corporate transactions are funding your nonprofit transactions, your charity transactions. That's a great business model. I love that. So I want to tap into you for a minute. I know you don't talk about yourself. I know you're humble in this sense, but to have people following you from thing to thing like that, I know that the part of it was the mission and the heart of the mission and the giving back to charities and things like that. And I totally appreciate that. But people follow leaders and you've been the leader. And so when I listen to your story, I'm wanting to know, what has Kieron done intentionally for the people in his organization where they want to follow?
I think one of the things that we really do intentionally is give everybody's opinion space and really, really genuinely believe that. I mentioned the telephone conferencing service. That was born out of an idea that came from one of the developers at the time, who came into the office and said, I've just had this really great idea about how we can use this new number range, O3 number range, which the regulator Ofcom had introduced in the UK and had a very different kind of pricing model attached to it. But he'd gone away, stepped away from the coding and just thought commercially, is there something we can do with this that's a little bit different, and brought that to the office. And we actually ended up creating an entirely different business because of that. So I think that recognition that you have a voice, and a voice that's going to be heard, and opinions that are going to be used and built upon, is really, really important. I know, these days we talk about active listening, but it really is active active listening kind of to the
It
next
is.
level.
Yeah.
It's let's make sure we act upon that. So I think that's
Yeah.
really key.
It's actually hearing them. It's not just listening
Yeah.
to them, it's hearing them and what they want to do with that. And, you have used the word penny drop and serendipitous a lot, but you're also showing there's intentionality behind it.
Yeah.
It's being open to the fact there's something else out there. And even with like the open banking, you recognized it. You didn't say that's competition. You said, how do we take advantage of that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and with that, I think we're really, again, the word disruptive is probably a little hackneyed these days, a bit overused, but we really want to use this opportunity to properly disrupt, because for the first time in 60 years, there is a different way to move money, and we can make that a huge benefit for everybody that's using it. But turning back to kind of intentional leadership and that listening and all of that, I think the other thing that we've always wanted to do is give people the sense that they can go in any direction within the business. We're a fairly small team, so that gives people huge opportunity. Meritocracy, again, I think is a word that's overused, but we absolutely do that. We would much prefer to promote from within than bring in somebody above whenever we can do that. But we've employed people whose degree is in marine biology, who've gone on to be move from kind of product management into doing some SEO work, then into project management, then into marketing, and just kind of followed their desire within the company, and then seen abilities emerge from that and move on and move out to other jobs. So I think that's really important, is just letting people have some space to find out really what works for them. If you can do that, I know that's not always possible, but if you can do that, I think that's a great thing.
But I think it can be done more often than people understand. And in the end, the heart of that is it's about you wanting them to be successful.
Yes.
If they're successful, they're going to be successful with your company. Sometimes success means it's not going to be with your company, but that's still a win-win.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I've always viewed it that way. You'll hear people saying, "Oh, do you not worry about spending money on training?" And then they're just going to take that training and get another job. Well, no, absolutely not. We want people to come into the organization and feel that they can make a difference, for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. So I appreciate wonderful listeners. You'll be able to see through the links in our show notes today how you can tap into that organization and Kieron and all those different things. But Kieron, we finish every show with the same question. It's a practical tip. What is something our listeners can do intentionally today to lead more effectively?
I think one of the things that we've done that's quite a simple thing, this is one practical thing. It's probably the wrong time of the year now for most of your listeners, but here's a practical bit of advice for a small business. We wanted to give people some headspace and actually look after themselves. And in those dark nights, those short days and long nights in the winter, one of the things practically we did was give people time to take a walk during the day when it's still light. And it was the simplest thing to put in place, and actually one of the most appreciated. And in reality, it costs us nothing, and everyone's coming back from that. Maybe they go for a jog, maybe they go for a walk, maybe they do anything. But sometimes in London, when the day's finished and it's already dark at 4:00 and it's rainy and wet and miserable, the last thing you want to do is go out there for a walk. So a very simple bit of practical advice, but if that's something that your business can afford its staff, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever you can do, I think it's massively appreciated for those autumn nights and winter nights.
I love that tip. And I love your phrase about that with headspace, because it's just that time to clear.
Completely.
Come back with better thinking,
Completely.
processing.
Absolutely. Just step away from it and give yourself a break. And again, I think that probably the people that appreciated that more than anyone were the coders and the developers, because often you just need to step away from the keyboard. You'll come back feeling much more refreshed and able to solve that problem.
Great tip. Well, Kieron, it's been fantastic to have you on the Intentional Leader podcast. We appreciate you and your leadership and what you're doing to help out, especially with charities and processing. And listeners, again, all of his links will be in the show notes today, so you can reach out to him if you would like to. But Kieron, thank you for being a guest, and we hope you have incredible serendipitous moments throughout the rest of the year.
Once again, many thanks, Sean.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast presented by Reenergize Professional Coaching. Be sure to see the show notes for links to Reenergize Professional Coaching and links to contact our guests. Now, hit that subscribe button so that you are alerted with every new episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast.